Where were you when it happened? I'm going to remember where I was for the rest of my life. He may not drive for my team anymore, but I'm going to remember for the rest of my Formula One watching career exactly where and when I was when Nico Hulkenberg got on the podium. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. This is an amazing day. No words can describe the joy that I felt finishing up watching the British Grand Prix here in 2025. I'm not going to hold this for the entire video, I promise, although it's taking every ounce of strength in my mental game to not do so, because while he does no longer drive for my team, I loved Nico Hulkenberg in his time in the Haas, and it's one of those things that it's one of those things in F1 where you're never convinced if it's actually going to happen. And then when it finally does, it's almost like you don't know what to do with yourself. I'm stumbling over my own words with the excitement that I felt today. I wish I could hold this the entire video, but at the same time, I feel extremely constricted and I'm kind of jamming it into my own throat. So what's going on, guys? We're here to talk about the 2025 British Grand Prix, everything that happened in it. We're going to talk about our weekend quick hits. We're going to go over our weekend winners and losers, I wonder, and then we'll wrap things up with our predictions championship right at the end. And then we'll take a look at what's next as F1 heads to a little mini summer break. I found a compromise. For it, although my light is currently reflecting off of it. I found a compromise so Nico can be in the frame the entire time. And actually, let me see if I can... There, I've at least positioned the light off to the side. But what's going on, guys? Let's jump into it with our quick hits, because I don't really know how to really describe the 2025 British Grand Prix other than just absolute insanity. We had a bunch of safety cars, we had torrential downpours, we had teams on inters when it was dry, we had teams on dries when it was wet. It was wild from the jump. I think where do you even begin? Just talking about, I think the weather is probably a good way to start it. I think this is another fantastic example of rain makes races. Throw in a strategic wrench into the cog that is F1 and things go absolutely haywire. And we saw it today here in Silverstone, as we saw a good bulk majority of the grid pit on the formation lap for slick tires. And then we effectively saw two entirely separate races taking part over the entirety of the race. You had the people on slicks who were going multiple seconds slower than the people who were on inters, but by the time that the slicks would have become better, the rain came back. And then by the time the rain came back, the people who stayed on inters had stayed on too long. You had people risking it and trying to stay on old inters, a la like Esteban Ocon. Everyone else who hit for fresh inters seemed to be the right strategy. And then over the course of the race, a torrential downpour later with a safety car to bunch up everybody. It was insanity, to say the least, but just rain makes races. Never forget that. All right, let's talk about our race results. Yes, Lando Norris won the British Grand Prix, but did you hear that Nico Hulkenberg finally finished on the podium after 239 races? He finally got his first podium. Can you believe it? Oscar Piastri also cost himself the win thanks to a self-inflicted penalty behind the safety car. He ended up slamming on the brakes after the safety car took off to re-enter the pits, ultimately earning himself a 10-second penalty, which at that point it was kind of done and gone. While he did have, I think it was like a 13-second gap before the safety car thanks to the intense weather. It ultimately cost him in the end, as Lando ultimately was basically right behind him the entire rest of the way. Oscar was probably the most distraught I think we've ever seen him after the race was over. Obviously extremely frustrated either at the decision to give the penalty or also probably a little bit on himself. You had McLaren saying that it was probably an unjust penalty, but at the same time, with Lando Norris winning, you can't really fight it that hard. And so this is an odd predicament that McLaren has put themselves in. But I think the biggest part about it is that Nico Hulkenberg finished on the podium for the first time in his career, and I think that's incredible. Elsewhere on the podium, oh, by the way, Nico Hulkenberg finished on the podium. For the first time in 239 tries, he finished on the podium in what formerly was a green wheelie bin called the Steak Sauber. It gives Sauber their first podium since 2012, and it is one of the greatest results I've ever seen. Not only the fact that it was a Sauber on the podium, but it was NICO HULKENBERG, who I believe that all of us saw when Stroll was somehow on the podium after it all shook out. We all saw and went, oh, that would be a great story, but he's still gonna just finish P4, but then we're gonna spend the rest of the day screaming about how he could have had a podium. But no, he had fantastic pace, passed Lance Stroll, and then held off a charging Lewis Hamilton in the waning laps to finish on the podium for, once again, I reiterate, NICO HULKENBERG finished on the podium in a Grand Prix in Formula One. It was an incredible day. I could not be more happy for my guy. It's one of the best achievements that I think you could have in his career, specifically with these stats that he's had. He's finally got that one off the side, and you could tell just the relief and the joy that washed over him as the podium celebration carried on. Elsewhere up and down the grid, a couple of things we need to talk about. A lot of, obviously, things that come with weather is a lot of rookie troubles. That's right. Of the 6 rookies that were currently on the grid, all but one, Ollie Behrman, DNF'd from this race from damage one way or another. Even Ollie Behrman spun out and almost took out his own teammate. So rookie troubles were not very few and far between, I almost said. They were prevalent from the start. You had Liam Lawson DNFing from the beginning. You had Gabriel Bortoleto. Actually, hold on. Franco Colapinto DNF'd before the lights went out. I believe after the formation lap, he came in and said he was stuck in second gear, and they ultimately retired the car to no fanfare whatsoever. You had Liam Lawson going out on the opening. You had Isaac Hadjar running through the back of Kimi Antonelli, who also ultimately would retire from that contact as well. And then lastly, who am I forgetting? Yeah, I think that's pretty much everybody. And I mentioned Behrman obviously spinning Esteban Ocon there towards the end as well. So it was a tough day to be a rookie in Formula One. Can't really blame them too much. The conditions might have been some of the most tricky you've seen in a very long time, with the very interchangeable conditions throughout, as well as a torrential downpour that ultimately got a couple of these rookies DNF themselves. So what a wild weekend for rookies. What a wild weekend overall. I think one of the other big talking points over this Grand Prix was obviously Max Verstappen taking a surprise pole position and ultimately fighting towards the front for basically, I think, as long as he realistically could have. Obviously, during the safety car restart that Oscar Piastri earned his 10-second penalty on that restart, Max Verstappen actually, in a very un-Max Verstappen-like, spun out of, Stowe, and ended up dropping all the way down towards P10, I think is where he settled in at. And so very un-Max-like, that he had obviously been having a lot of troubles with the Red Bull over the course of the weekend. We saw plenty of clips of him really struggling to get up to speed with the setup this weekend. And very uncharacteristically, I remember seeing him just kind of spin out off into the distance and just kind of losing my mind a little bit, because that gave Oscar Piastri what should have been a nice, clear victory. Ultimately, it ended up not being that way. But at the same time, it was a wild result. I was expecting Max to be fighting all the way to the end. Ultimately, he did climb back up and finish, I think, P6, I think it was. And so P5 or 6, one of those two. I think it might have been P5. So it was not too shabby of a result, but at the same time, uncharacteristically a mistake from Max on that one. And I think the only last point I have to make is, once again, did I mention NICO HULKENBERG? Let's go ahead and move on to our weekend winners and losers. I will not belabor the weekend winner, because if it is not obvious who I'm going to pick this weekend, you have not been paying attention up to this point in the video. My weekend winner is obviously NICO HULKENBERG. 239 races on your career, multiple missed opportunities and what if moments to finish on the podium or even get wins. It was coming down to a point where a lot of people were convinced that you were going to go down as the undisputed champion in terms of race starts without a podium. And I could not be happier for him, his family, his career, us, the fans. I think it became very obvious, while a lot of people were really excited about Lando Norris winning his home race this week, and this race result was dedicated to NICO HULKENBERG, and that makes my heart so happy. Moving on to weekend loser this week, and I'm actually this might be a first where I'm actually gonna kind of leave it up to you guys because I really struggled to figure out the loser for this weekend. I think there's not a lot of obvious candidates. You have, like, I mentioned the rookies obviously had a very, very long day at the office, many DNFs and a lot of mistakes throughout. It could be them. There's an argument to be made. There's Max, who spun from second position coming off of the safety car restart. You had Oscar getting his penalty on aforementioned safety car restart. I think there's just a lot of good options. There's not particularly a clear one. If I was going to pick one, I think I would probably actually just go with the rookies. But at the same time, I would love to hear what you guys think. Let me know down what your pick for weekend loser would be down in the comment section below. All right, now finally, let's go over the predictions that we made before the weekend began, and we'll give an update on our community predictions championship. We'll begin with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went with Isaac Hadjar this weekend. I feel like it had been more than a few weekends in a row that Hadjar has had his struggles. I expected him to kind of bounce back this weekend, and it looks like it was on the fence-ish until we got to the race and saw the conditions. Ultimately, Hadjar was well at the back before unfortunately making a mistake and taking out himself and Kimi Antonelli going towards Copse there in the monsoon that was this race. And so unfortunately, no points for me there. We await the return of the Hadjar for sure. As we move on now to my pick for biggest disappointment, and I went with Gabriel Bortoleto coming off of his first points finish in Austria last time out. I thought it was only natural that we would see a step back from the rookie, although he looked extremely on pace in Austria. I think we saw him kind of struggle a little bit over the course of the weekend, crashing a couple of times, having some issues before ultimately just making a mistake in the wet conditions, getting on the power and getting a little too greedy, found himself in the barrier, and that was his day done and dusted. So that's a point for me there. Moving on to qualifying top three, I actually ended up doing pretty decently in this one. I was not foreseeing a Max Verstappen pole position, but at the same time, it did give me an Oscar Piastri P2. So I got a point for that one, and then I also predicted Lando to be on pole, and so he obviously came home in third, so a half point for me there. Max Verstappen nowhere to be found in my top three, so 1.5 points for me in qualifying, bringing me up to 2.5 points on the trot. Not too shabby. As we move on to my race podium, I thought we were going to get an Oscar Piastri win, a Lando Norris P2, and a George Russell P3. Obviously, George Russell and Mercedes made the worst strategy call you probably could have made in the race today, not only going to slicks but also choosing to go to the hard tires on a track that was probably more suited towards mediums at minimum. So George nowhere near on the podium. I think he finished 10th, and so he got a single point on the weekend but nowhere near the podium. For P2, I had Lando Norris and an Oscar Piastri win, which looks like it could have been on the cards, but unfortunately Oscar had to go and get himself a penalty, and ultimately Lando Norris takes the win. So flip-flop those, and we end up taking home a single points in total for the race podium. As we move on to my one crazy prediction, and this is the one that I absolutely cooked on going into the weekend. My one crazy prediction was that Lewis Hamilton would out-qualify and then also finish ahead of Charles Leclerc in the Grand Prix itself. This was only the second time that he's finished ahead of Charles in a Grand Prix, and while he has out-qualified him a couple of times, this is the first time this combination has happened all season long. So ding, 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 that's a point for me. This one was the one that I felt like I cooked on the most, and I'm rewarded for it with a point. So we bring home, if I check my math, which I've double-checked and triple-checked before I started recording this video, I brought home 4.5 points, far and away the best of the weekend. So one of my better weekends, to say the least. I think I cooked pretty well, and the conditions probably kept me from a little bit more, but at the same time, I'm not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. As we take a look at our current standings for the Predictions Championship, we still have Senna out front now on 48.5 points. Me now in sole second place pretty comfortably, cracking the 40-point barrier as well with 40.5 points. We have British TTG with 36.5 points. F1 Inferno catching British in his chase with 33.5. Andrew unfortunately did not get their predictions in for the weekend, so no points for them there, and they continue to sit on 24.5 points. So We have a long way to go as we are halfway through the F1 season. That only leaves one question left. What's next in Formula One? It's one of my favorite race weekends on the calendar. We go to Spa, Belgium for the Belgian Grand Prix. Spa, while it may not necessarily agree with this current era of Formula One cars, it is one of my favorite tracks in the entire world, and I am looking forward to it so much. It just kind of sucks. We have I think it's 3 weeks before we get to race weekend, and so it's going to be a long break, but I think a little bit of a break will do us all pretty good. Last time out in Spa, we had a Hamilton win, a Piastri P2, and a Leclerc P3 on the podium. This was Lewis's back-to-back wins last season with Mercedes. It was a crazy race last year with George ultimately being disqualified after executing the perfect one stop to take the win. Unfortunately for him, it was stripped, but crazy weekend. What do you think is going to happen? I, for one, can't wait to find out. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one. The British Grand Prix always seems to just deliver. It's just, for whatever reason, I think it's just the UK weather unpredictability, as well as just the track being pretty dang good. Rain makes races. I'll say it again, rain makes races. And for the final time in this video, did I mention NICO HULKENBERG finishing on the podium?